most fighters who've had longer fighting careers or fought 20 plus fights typically have that one fight that fight fans are going to associate with them. And, and of course I have that as well. And unlike these guys who've had 20 fights or so, I've had 400 fights.
The story of Travis Fulton is a complex one. The MMA world knows him as the all-time record holder for most MMA fights with an incredible 324 recorded pro bouts. He's also the all-time MMA KO leader with 143, most all-time submissions with 104, and most all-time wins with 257. He's also an accused pedophile who hung himself in prison when faced with the prospect of a lengthy sentence and staining his reputation. A reputation that was built on lies and deceit. Fulton was born in Waterloo, Iowa, and raised in Cedar Falls. His father worked for the John Deere Company, but was eventually laid off, sending the family into deep poverty from an early age. In school, Fulton was seriously bullied to the point where he actually came up with a plan to kill his tormentors and then subsequently kill himself. However, success in multiple sports, including baseball and football, caused him to become more popular amongst his peers and basically put an end to the bullying. While attending Cedar Falls High School, he was a state competitor in wrestling, but was kicked off the team several times, usually for skipping class. He was also a Golden Gloves boxer and a second-degree black belt in American Kenpo Karate. Now, after seeing UFC 3 on pay-per-view, coupled with his love for the movie Bloodsport, he quickly gravitated to this new blossoming sport of no-holds-barred fighting, and he even began training in submission fighting with fellow Iowa native Pat Miletich at Miletich Fighting Systems in Battendorf. He made his pro debut in 1996 at age 19 and lost by first-round submission against future UFC veteran Dave Strasser. By the end of 1996, he had 3 fights and held a 2-1 record. The next year, in 1997, he fought 24 times, going 16-6-2. By the end of 1998, Travis Fulton, still only age 21, had earned the name Iron Man, holding a record of 49 wins, 13 losses, and 5 draws. And this earned him respect too. He was personally invited and competed at the prestigious ADCC tournament in Abu Dhabi in 1999, where he was defeated in the first round by Josh Barnett. Less than 3 months after that, he was brought in to compete at UFC 20, losing to Lions Den fighter Pete Williams by first-round submission. And Williams was actually given a title fight with Kevin Randleman on the basis of that win over Travis Fulton, showing that at the time he had a legitimate reputation. The company's next show, UFC 21, they again include Travis Fulton. He officially picks up his first win with the promotion, taking a decision over David Dodd. That would, however, be the last time he was ever seen in the UFC octagon. The next few years were seemingly stuff of legend though. He toured Japan, the UK, went to Russia, fought basically every weekend, and usually fought in one-night tournaments where he might fight up to 2 or 3 times in the same night. And he was legit too. Fulton mixed it up with some of the best during that time. He took on the likes of Rico Rodriguez, Babalu Sobral, Evan Tanner, even a young 5-0 Rich Ace Franklin. And then on June 30th, 2001, a new upstart promotion in California by the name of Extreme Cage Fighting, also known as the WEC, held its inaugural show at the Tachi Palace Hotel and Casino in Lemoore, California. After Chuck Liddell fell off, the company needed a high-profile main event for their debut, so they brought in recognizable UFC veteran Dan the Beast Severn, and more or less offered that he could pick his opponent for the fight. And the man Severn chose to dance with that night was none other than the Iron Man, Travis Fulton. Fulton and Severn were no strangers to one another at this point. They had actually already fought twice previously, with the most recent one just being 8 months prior. On both occasions, Severn won the fights by first-round submission, and this really would not have been considered that competitive of a main event. And this is the exact point where things start to stink a little bit. Despite handedly defeating Fulton in the prior 2 outings, the trilogy fight at WEC 1 involves a lot more back and forth grappling. More or less, Dan's making him look good in there, and you can noticeably see a few funny looking spots that you just don't see very often in MMA. Whenever Dan Severn is on top, he chooses not to strike. Whenever Fulton ends up on top, he also opts not to try to cause any damage, and in the end, Dan Severn gets the unanimous decision. It moves him to 3-0 in fights against Travis Fulton, and everybody goes home. But not everybody goes home happy. The International Fighting Championship, or IFC for short, was another California-based promotion which began operation in 1996. Now, they were pretty legitimate. They had one-night tournaments in Ukraine with some of the best guys, including Igor Vojtchinchin, and at the time, they were considered probably the second biggest promotion in the United States, next to the UFC. Now, just 9 days after the Fulton-Severn trilogy match at WEC 1, the IFC formally suspended both Dan Severn, Travis Fulton, as well as Dan Severn's manager Becky Levy from participating in any of its shows until further notice. The suspensions were a direct result of an apparent violation of IFC rules about predetermining the outcome of a fight. The company would go on to state, during the fight between Severn and Fulton on June 30th, it became apparent to referee Mason White that Travis Fulton was holding back from punching Dan Severn when Fulton had Severn in full mount. Upon questioning him following the fight, Fulton disclosed that prior to the fight, Becky Levy approached him on behalf of Dan Severn. At that meeting, Levy told Fulton that they don't want this fight unless they get paid more money. Fulton claims that Levy said to go easy and guarantee Severn the victory or they would not take it. Fulton accepted. Becky Levy would immediately deny the allegations, but instead of refuting the fight itself, the only thing really being accused of the fix, she instead went on a huge tirade detailing all the events leading up to the fight, including Dan not being paid in full, having no idea who they were fighting and only figuring out it was Travis Fulton, hours before the matchup, not really wanting to hurt anybody because that's not Dan's MO, a misunderstanding of the rules meeting, and of course that Dan had 2 more fights booked over the next 2 weekends, so he didn't really want to overexert himself. She said she did speak to Travis Fulton and his friend Bruce Nelson backstage, but a fix was never discussed. Travis Fulton, meanwhile, wanted to give his side of the story, and so he goes on a blog post on the Underground and states, Dan has done a few works, but has never done a work that hurt a promoter. Either the promoter knew or it was his own event. Severn has a financial interest in keeping the works secret. Severn is a good guy though. His works are as follows: versus Kohler, versus Japanese guy in New Japan, versus Butterbean, versus me and DZ, and then 2 more that I am not at liberty to speak about. But I know for a fact that they were works. I can't tell you though because I'd lose friends in the process. This is a very interesting comment here by Fulton. He's essentially claiming that the fight at WEC was not a work, but that the fight with Severn from 8 months prior at Danger Zone indeed was. And for the record, Danger Zone was an MMA promotion owned and operated by Dan the Beast Severn himself. Almost comically, less than 3 months after the entire Dan Severn versus Travis Fulton debacle at WC1, they actually met for a 4th time at a small regional show in Iowa, and in a classic pro wrestling move, they fought to a draw to save face. They hoped that it would quiet down the talks, and because it was still only 2001 and the sport was so small with such a niche audience, it actually worked. Despite serious allegations of fight fixing, it did nothing to affect the career of Travis Fulton. He would go on to compete nearly 200 more times over the next decade, finally retiring in 2019 with a record of 257, 55, and 10. But that comment about working matches with Dan Severn from back in 2001, it's still real. It still means something. Back then, the sport was still in its dark days and only lived in the far corners of the internet chat boards. Nobody gave it serious thought before, but the evidence was always there. When you go back and look through the record of Travis Fulton, you'll begin to notice a pattern of opponents, usually the same group of guys brought in specifically to job to him. He fought Clayton Miller 4 times, winning 3 of them in the first round before settling for a draw in the 4th meeting. Very similar to how things went with Dan Severn. That 4th draw just to throw people off if they get suspicious. He fought Dan Kroonquist 4 times, finishing him all 4 times in the first round, and actually beating him 3 times in 1997 alone. He fought Albert Newberry 4 times, again winning all 4 in the very first round. There was Jeremy Armstrong, Manuel Quiros, Brad Schulten, and a host of many others. In total, he fought 33 different guys at least twice, meaning he's actually also the all-time record holder for most rematches, most trilogies, and most times fighting the exact same guy. Now, you can make the argument that maybe he's just the world's greatest can crusher and he's not actually fixing these fights, just specifically fighting hand-picked low-level guys in a real situation. But then you look into the manner of victory, and it tells you where there's smoke, there's usually fire. Travis Fulton fought Tony Day for the first time on August 11th, 2001, knocking him out in just 38 seconds into the very first round. They met in a rematch 5 months later, and again, Fulton knocked out Day 124 of round 1. And then just 10 days later, he apparently knocked him out again, 34 seconds into the very first round. How is it possible to defeat the same opponent by knockout twice in a span of 10 days? Sure, there's no acting athletic commission, but that very fact in itself is what makes this not all that hard to believe. Athletic commission aside, how could this man agree to fight 10 days apart after getting knocked out so quickly? He would have taken damage. He would have known he couldn't win the fight. He had already been soundly beaten 5 months prior to this by the exact same outcome. Didn't he have any friends or family that worried he might get hurt? Only that's the thing. These guys weren't getting hurt. They were partaking in a shoot-style pro wrestling match. Travis would agree not to hurt them in the fights and almost universally would finish them in the first round. If you look back at the fights where Travis is trying, he has an advanced skill set for the time. He's got big time ground and pound, solid takedowns, some decent boxing dating from his Golden Glove days, and yet in these specific fights, he usually chooses to score the takedown, end up in a side control type position, maybe guard, and just decides to hold down his opponents. There are no elbows, there is no ground and pound, and you can see him at various times speaking to his opponent throughout the course of the match. And if you think the behavior of Tony Day is just the work of a deranged, desperate fighter, he's just the tip of the iceberg. Travis Fulton fought Dan Wheatley on October 6, 2004, winning the fight via head kick knockout with no recorded time of the round. 17 days later, they fought again, and it was an identical outcome. First round KO via head kick with no recorded round or time. To think a man was knocked out twice in a 17-day span with the exact same head kick sounds crazy. Even crazier, after sustaining all that damage, both men fought again 11 days later on November 3rd, with Fulton scoring a TKO 148 into the first round. The two men also fought twice more in 2005, once in 2006, and Fulton went 6-0, all 6 wins by knockout. Brian Robinson has the exact same story. Fulton went 5-0 against him, winning all 5 fights inside the distance. The first of which is most laughable because he apparently beat Robinson with a spinning back kick just 30 seconds into the fight at an event aptly titled Kickfest. Now you have almost 400 Travis Fulton fights that you can look at, and at no point does he even throw a spinning back kick, nor does he know how to throw a spinning back kick. Now how about Bruce Nelson? If the name sounds familiar, it's because it's the same Bruce Nelson that Dan Severn's manager, Becky Levy, is alleged to have spoken to along with Travis Fulton just prior to the WEC work. The same Bruce Nelson that was a known friend of Travis. They actually fought twice on the same day on September 23, 2000, with Fulton winning the first one by KO in the first round, and then the second one just moments later by guillotine in the first round. They had their trilogy match in 2002 with another first round TKO for Fulton, and then in a true sign of pro wrestling tribute, they fought to a draw in the 4th meeting in 2003. Yes, a draw in the 4th meeting, despite the one-sided outcomes in the previous 3. Same as Dan Severn, same as Clayton Miller. To think all these men weren't in on it really starts to become harder the more you look at it. But really, it's a man by the name of Rory Prazik who breaks this thing wide open. Travis Fulton and Rory Prazik first fought September 17, 2003, with Travis, as always, winning inside the distance. In 2004, the pair fought 3 more times, with Fulton winning all 3 by submission. If people were starting to get tired of it, that's okay, because Travis Fulton also doubled as a professional boxer. Not nearly as prolific as his MMA career, Fulton was already 8-7 as a boxer when he fought Rory Prazik, who was making his pro debut. Without the option to submit him, obviously he would win the fight by TKO, and so, sure enough, it was a different outcome than all the MMA fights. That meant that the two had fought 4 times in 2004 alone, and 5 times overall. Then in 2005, they fought twice more in MMA, and boxed again. Then in 2006, they fought MMA once, and boxed for a 3rd time. In 2007, the gig was up, so they worked one last fight for old time's sake, with Fulton winning via keylock submission in the 4th round of an apparent title fight. All in all, Travis Fulton went 8-0 versus Rory Prazik in MMA and 3-0 versus him as a pro boxer over a 4-year span. 11 wins, of course, all 11 coming inside the distance. Strangely enough, Rory Prazik only ever fought 3 times as a boxer, being exclusively an opponent for Travis Fulton, knowing he wasn't going to get hurt in there. If you gloss over Travis Fulton's box recs, you'll quickly spot other recognizable names such as Clayton Miller, Brian Robinson, Manuel Quiros, Dan Quigley, all of them making their pro debuts. Because let's be real, none of them were actually professional boxers, they were all being brought in by Fulton to do a job. If you tally up his record versus his favorite 11 choice opponents, Travis Fulton is an astonishing 43-0 with 2 draws, all 43 wins coming inside the distance. The greatest record in the history of the sport by a landslide. Of those 11 choice opponents, he used 5 of them to further his boxing career, going 10-0 with 10 knockouts. As time went on, the sport grew. Fulton eventually winded down and began to compete less. In 2018, at age 41, he decided to take on fellow well-traveled regional fighter Jonathan Ivey. Yes, they had fought once previously back in 2002. Yes, Fulton had won that fight via first-round submission. And yes, Jonathan Ivey even came into the fight with a Travis Fulton tattoo, but it was a legitimate fight. Ivey faked a heart attack, landed some mild ground and pound, and then realizing he was about to win the fight, stepped back and tapped out, giving Fulton the win. He would claim that he had too much respect for Travis, who actually did seem genuinely confused by what was going on, but it's another stinky moment in a career that's beginning to reek. He would more or less announce his retirement from fighting right then. He had flirted with the idea dating back to 2013 when he actually did a Vice Fightland interview, but it just didn't feel right to end his career like that. Not when there was one more work that still needed to be done. Fight fixing is a very serious allegation. There's only a small handful of fighters who have ever been proven to have worked matches over the course of MMA history. But when you look at it, there's one name that stands out far above the rest. It's not Dan Severn, hell, it's not even Travis Fulton. It's Shannon the Cannon Rich. Rich has been fighting pro since 1998, same time frame as Fulton. Both men fought everyone in the game, and both men are accused of fixing fights with Dan B. Severn. Yet strangely enough, their paths had never previously crossed. While Travis worked his fights to win, Shannon Rich was actually the opposite. He came to lose. Sporting a record of 58 wins and 90 losses, people often wondered how a man into his late 40s competed so often and lost so often without taking any real damage. But that goes back to the art of the work. Shannon Rich is accredited BJJ black belt, and yet he's been submitted 49 times in his pro career. In fact, in 152 recorded fights, he's never been to decision once, not in victory, not in defeat. It made almost too much sense that if Travis was going to do one last job, it would be against the Cannon. And so on April 4th, 2019, M1 Global, a longtime Russian-based promotion, decided to have a US show in California, and they put the two together for the long-awaited showdown. In another pro wrestling style move, they even made it a title fight for the M1 Super Fight World title and marketed it as a fight between the number 1 and number 2 most experienced MMA fighters of all time. And so, as you probably guessed it, Travis Fulton defeated Shannon Rich. Yes, it was by submission, and no, nobody got hurt. Travis quietly retired, and Shannon the Cannon, he forged on for a little while, fighting 3 more times despite being 50 years old. And so begs the question, why? Was it for the fame? Surely there was no real money involved. So what was the motive behind all this? Although we will now never know the true answer to that question, we can speculate, and it seems to point towards a bit of both. Fulton was known as a bit of a recluse back home. He lived alone in rural Iowa with just one daughter. He had grand dreams after a promising baseball career fell through and never really getting that far in school or wrestling. After starting his pro career just 4-4, he devised a plan that would make him look like he was one of the best fighters on the planet, and to some degree, it worked. Fulton decided due to a lack of commission or rules, he would make Iowa his home base. And after a 4-4 start, he actually goes an incredible 166, 5-6 in his home state. Those 6 losses are all to legitimate studs, including former UFC champ Rich Franklin, longtime KO or bust machine Travis View twice, Ultimate Fighter and Big Show veteran Mike Whitehead, and former UFC champions Dan Severn and Rico Rodriguez. And that was the thing, Travis Fulton was by no means willing to mix it up with some of the sport's best fighters, but he wanted to get paid for it, and he wanted to travel and see the world. So the plan was simple. He would work fights in Iowa, build up a good-looking record, at which point promoters would bring him in, pay him some decent money, and he would fight legitimate guys. If he lost, no big deal. He could just go back on a 4-fight winning streak by the end of the month and do it all over again. And this scheme almost worked to perfection. In total, he traveled the world competing in 14 different countries, including Canada, Japan, Brazil, England, Russia, Georgia, Belarus, Croatia, Slovakia, Ukraine, Germany, Guam, Abu Dhabi, and nearly half a dozen paid trips to Hawaii. He was even invited by the UFC to compete on season 8 of The Ultimate Fighter in 2008 at 205 pounds, and he was just unable to make the weight in time. This was in fact doing pretty well for a mid-level club fighter from a small town in Iowa. He also had the full respect of all of his peers, and to his credit, he didn't flop every time out. He had huge wins over Heath Herring, Joe Riggs, Wesley Cabbage Carrera, Wes Sims, an Ultimate Fighter and UFC veteran Kerry the Meat Truck Shaw. And even when he lost, it was almost exclusively to named fighters. 30 of his 55 pro losses are to UFC veterans, including 6 world champions in Dan Severn, Rich Franklin, Rico Rodriguez, Forrest Griffin, Evan Tanner, and Andrei Arlovsky. When you add in legends like Jeremy Horn, Babalu Sobral, 2 fights with Big Ben Rothwell, it's actually admirable, even in defeat. So why bother doing the fixed fights on the side? And that's because it's pretty clear he's not actually at that level. Against quality opponents, he did manage a few nice wins, but mostly he was on the receiving end of the losses. If that pattern would have continued, he'd have an awful looking record and promoters wouldn't really want to bring him in or pay him a decent chunk of change. So he needed to work fights in between to pad things out and make him look like he was in demand. To give you an idea of how he would utilize his crew, after any setback, he would immediately rebound with a quick win streak. In fact, for a guy with such an extensive record, he rarely ever lost 2 fights in a row and almost never lost inside the state of Iowa. Those are the fights that are in question. A good example of this would be his fight with Mike Radnov in 2001. Keep in mind that's the same year that he's known to have worked 2 fights against Dan Severn. After losing to Radnov out of state, he returns to Iowa and within a 19-day span goes on a 3-fight winning streak, all 3 of those wins coming inside the distance. Those 3 wins, if you ask, 2 against Tony Day, 1 against Bruce Nelson. So how did he get away with it? Well, it was easy at first. He's first suspected of working matches as early as 1997, and really it would have been easy in those times. There was no official record keeper, information was loosely passed around, and the internet didn't exist to look into these claims. It was more or less just word of mouth. Once the Ultimate Fighter blew up and put the UFC on the map in 2004, it became a lot harder to get away with these stunts at the risk of the promoters catching you. So he drew one last play call from Dan the Beast Severn's playbook and started his own promotion. Like he claimed back in 2001, Dan would only work the match if the promoter was in on it or it was on his own show. Once the sport blew up in popularity, promoters would no longer agree to be in on it, but you could still pull a fast one on your own promoted events. And that's exactly what he did. Starting in 2006, Iron Man Fighting Championship was his first venture. But after going 16-0 for them, it became a little too obvious, so he would routinely change the name. He had twice competed for Severn's Danger Zone promotion and admitted to working the second one against Dan, an event that was actually named Night of the Beast. It wouldn't have even been a stretch to think that some of these fights may not have even taken place. Competing on those Iron Man FC cards, he often fought debuting opponents that would never go on to compete ever again. Why would somebody debut versus a 200 fight plus veteran, lose, and then not at least fight one more time against a more evenly skilled opponent? In at least one case, he fought Steve Fiskus twice, and those are the only 2 times the name Steve Fiskus has ever appeared anywhere. If it sounds crazy, keep in mind this wouldn't be the first instance of this in MMA. In September 2016, Canadian promotion TKO MMA announced they were terminating the contract of one of their fighters for faking bouts on his record. The fighter in question was 5-7 Christ Frank, who the company alleged created 4 fake events where he fought and won to improve his record from 5-7 to 9-7. The promotion in question, entitled African Warriors Championship, was indeed fake, and all Frank's 4 opponents had either been inactive or invented in order to bolster his resume. Frank even had himself winning a pair of one-night tournaments in Togo that in reality never actually happened. The promotion put out an official statement in part that read, "The false and fraudulent declarations of Mr. Frank in regards to his last 4 fights in Africa are a shame to our sport. This is the first in the history of MMA, and we hope that this type of situation never happens again." Both Sherdog and Tapology have also been misled, as these events never took place. In my opinion, this is not the first time in the history of MMA that this has happened, and Travis likely indulged in this type of activity as well. Of note though from that statement is the fact that both major record keepers, Sherdog and Tapology, were misled, easily misled. So easy in fact in 2016 that one could only imagine how easy it would have been to do so in the early to mid 2000s. When you build a life based on lies and deceit, oftentimes the universe has a way of balancing itself out. The word karma dates back over 3,000 years, and it's still widely considered one of the spiritual forces that a vast majority of people feel a connection to. You can never truly know what goes behind closed doors and in people's personal lives. We can only judge people on what we see in front of us. To the MMA world, Travis the Iron Man Fulton was a cult hero, a multiple-time record holder, the definition of a true fighter. In reality, he was no Iron Man. He was a Tin Man, a liar, and worst of all, he was a pedophile. The media is quick to point out that he was a cage fighter, one with too many fights at that. He had been hit too many times, and even though he had won a lot of his fights, he also had 55 losses, 13 of which were by knockout. But deep down, the signs were there long before. In a 2008 10 Questions with Travis Fulton interview, writer Derek Patrick conducts a pretty uneventful interview before getting to softball question number 9. Tell us something about you most people don't know. To which Fulton responds, I'll spare you the perverted response to this question and give you a G-rated fact about myself. I'm related to Abraham Lincoln. Now I know what you're thinking. Damn, he was related to Abraham Lincoln? But it's actually the first statement that stands out most, given the news that would later come. In 2013, Fulton was accused of persuading a 13-year-old girl to take part in meditation and to remove her clothing with the exception of her underwear. Records state that he allegedly placed her in a trance and performed a sex act. When initially questioned by investigators, Fulton admitted to the meditation session but denied any physical touching ever took place. He told authorities that he had been accused of rape in the past because people within the community knew who he was. The case was ultimately dismissed, and Fulton went on to compete another 10 more times in MMA after this. He even fought in Ukraine for a title against future UFC standout Sergey Spivak and a bout in Slovakia against former Bellator light heavyweight champion Attila Vey. At the time, no one gave the allegations much thought, but the writing was on the wall. On February 19, 2021, Travis John Fulton, age 44, was arrested by the U.S. Marshal Service in Iowa and indicted on charges that he enticed a girl under the age of 18 into engaging into sexual acts and taking photographs. By March, a federal grand jury expanded the indictment to include a second victim under the age of 18 who had also come forward. Records also show that he was formally charged with possessing and receiving child porn. In one case, court records showed the exploitation occurred between June 2013 and April 2020. In the other, the incidents are alleged to have occurred in November 2020. He was initially given a trial date, but a judge canceled it and scheduled a plea hearing for July 23, 2021, after it was announced that Fulton had pleaded guilty and had taken a deal with the state. His defense initially challenged a search warrant that led to the seizure of electronic devices and digital storage items where investigators found the child pornography images. Separately to that, Fulton also faced state charges including causing willful injury in Black Hawk County. According to the court records, officers had responded on September 5, 2019 to an emergency room in Waterloo, Iowa, where a woman was being treated for broken bones. Facing mounting evidence and charges, Fulton signed a document committing to pleading guilty at the upcoming plea hearing on July 23rd. But just hours later, he was dead. According to the Lynn County Sheriff's Office, Travis John Fulton, the Iron Man, was found unresponsive in a cell block at the Lynn County Jail shortly before 4 a.m. Saturday, July 10th. Correctional officers began performing CPR, and paramedics arrived on the scene within minutes, transporting him to the Mercy Medical Center in Cedar Rapids, where he was officially pronounced dead at 5 in the morning. According to the Sheriff's Office, deputies believe that he hung himself.
My name is Travis Fulton. I am a jiu-jitsu and wrestling stylist. I'm strong both on my feet and on the ground, and I'll be fighting in the middleweight tournament tonight, and I'll do whatever it takes to win.